What if one day your government admitted that a secret army had been operating inside your country for decades? Not enemy spies, not foreign soldiers, but a hidden network created by your own allies. For nearly half a century, these organizations remained invisible. Their members lived ordinary lives. Their weapons were buried in secret caches. Their communications systems waited silently for a war that never came. Then in 1990, an announcement from the Italian government stunned Europe. A secret Cold War program, known as Operation Gladio, was real. As journalists and investigators dug deeper, they discovered that Italy was not alone. Similar networks had existed across much of Western Europe. The official explanation seemed straightforward. These groups were created to resist a Soviet invasion if NATO defenses collapsed. But that was not the end of the story. As more information emerged, questions began to multiply. Why had these armies remained secret for so long? Who controlled them? And were they always focused on defending Europe from foreign threats? Or had some become involved in conflicts much closer to home? The answers would lead into one of the most controversial and debated chapters of Cold War history. A story of espionage, secrecy, terrorism investigations, and political intrigue. This is the story of Operation Gladio, the secret army that haunted Cold War Europe. To understand Operation Gladio, it is necessary to return to the years immediately after World War II. Europe had survived one devastating conflict only to find itself entering another. The alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union quickly collapsed and was replaced by deep mistrust. By the late 1940s, many Western leaders believed that another war was possible. This time the enemy would not be Nazi Germany. It would be the Soviet Union. Events across Europe seemed to reinforce those fears. Communist governments emerged in Eastern Europe. The Berlin blockade brought tensions to dangerous levels, and intelligence agencies on both sides prepared for the possibility of a future conflict. Western military planners faced a troubling question. What would happen if Soviet armies crossed into Western Europe and occupied entire countries before NATO could stop them? The answer was a secret strategy known as the Stay-Behind Network. Across several European countries, small groups of trusted individuals were recruited and trained for a mission they hoped would never become necessary. If invasion occurred, these people would remain behind enemy lines. They would gather intelligence, sabotage military targets, maintain communications, and organize resistance movements. Weapons, radios, explosives, and emergency supplies were hidden in secret locations. Many of these caches remained undiscovered for decades. In Italy, this network became known as Gladio. Named after the ancient Roman sword, the organization was intended to be a hidden shield waiting in reserve for a national emergency. From the perspective of Cold War planners, the idea seemed reasonable. Europe had experienced occupation before. Resistance movements had played important roles during World War II. Creating similar networks for a possible future conflict appeared to be a sensible precaution. Yet there was one problem. The Soviet invasion never happened. Year after year, the Cold War continued, but the secret armies remained unused. As decades passed, their existence became known only to a small circle of military and intelligence officials. Most citizens never heard a word about them. And because the networks remained hidden, they also remained largely beyond public scrutiny. For many years, few people questioned their existence because almost nobody knew they existed. That would change dramatically when investigators in Italy began uncovering evidence that suggested the story of Gladio was much larger and far more controversial than anyone had imagined. As investigations later revealed, Gladio was not simply an Italian operation. Versions of the Stay-Behind network existed across much of Western Europe. Belgium, the Netherlands, France, West Germany, Greece, Turkey, and several other countries maintained similar structures during the Cold War. Their exact organization differed from nation to nation, but the mission remained largely the same. Prepare for resistance if Soviet forces occupied Western Europe. The scale of the network surprised many observers after it became public. Secret weapons caches had been hidden in forests, mountains, and rural areas. Some contained firearms, explosives, radios, and survival supplies. In several countries, these caches were discovered only after official investigations began. Members were often former soldiers, intelligence personnel, or civilians considered reliable and strongly anti-communist. Most were trained in secrecy and knew little about the broader organization. The compartmentalized structure ensured that very few individuals understood the full scope of the network. To supporters, this secrecy was necessary. A resistance force could not function if its plans were publicly known. To critics, however, the secrecy created another problem. Organizations operating for decades without meaningful public oversight inevitably raised questions about accountability. Who supervised them? Who decided their activities? And how could democratic governments ensure that such secret structures remained within their intended mission? For years, those questions remained largely theoretical. Then Italy entered one of the most violent periods in its modern history. A period marked by bombings, assassinations, political extremism, and fear. And it was there that the controversy surrounding Gladio would truly begin. By the late 1960s, Italy had become one of the most politically divided countries in Western Europe. The Cold War was no longer being fought only through armies and intelligence agencies. It was increasingly being fought through ideology. On one side stood conservative and anti-communist forces determined to keep Italy firmly aligned with the West. On the other stood powerful left-wing movements, including the Italian Communist Party, which had become one of the largest communist parties in democratic Europe. The political atmosphere grew increasingly tense. Protests filled the streets. Labor strikes disrupted industry. Student movements challenged traditional institutions. Many Italians feared their country was moving toward a period of instability. Then the violence began. On December 12, 1969, a bomb exploded inside the National Agrarian Bank in Milan's Piazza Fontana. 17 people were killed and dozens more were wounded. The attack shocked the nation. Authorities initially focused on anarchists and left-wing suspects. Several people were arrested and publicly blamed. But as investigators continued their work, serious doubts began to emerge. Evidence increasingly pointed toward far-right extremist groups rather than those originally accused. The case became one of the most controversial investigations in modern Italian history, and it marked the beginning of what would later be called the Years of Lead. Over the next decade, Italy experienced a wave of political violence unlike anything seen elsewhere in Western Europe. Far-left groups, such as the Red Brigades, carried out kidnappings, assassinations, and attacks against government targets. The most famous of these attacks occurred in 1978, when former Prime Minister Aldo Moro was kidnapped and later murdered. At the same time, far-right extremist organizations were linked to bombings that targeted civilians in public spaces. Ordinary Italians found themselves living in an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty. Train stations, banks, public squares, government buildings. Almost any crowded location could become a target. As the attacks continued, investigators noticed a disturbing pattern. Some cases appeared to involve deliberate efforts to misdirect investigations. Evidence disappeared. Witnesses changed their stories. And certain inquiries encountered unusual obstacles. These developments gave rise to a controversial theory that became known as the strategy of tension. According to this theory, some acts of terrorism were intended not only to kill people, but also to create fear across society. The objective would be to convince the public that Italy faced growing chaos and instability. Supporters of the theory argued that fear could influence political decisions and strengthen support for more aggressive anti-communist policies. It is important to understand that the strategy of tension remains a subject of historical debate. Some elements are supported by court findings, parliamentary investigations, and documented evidence. Others remain disputed among historians, researchers, and former officials. The existence of political violence is not debated. The question is how different groups and institutions may have interacted behind the scenes. This debate eventually intersected with Operation Gladio. One of the most important figures in uncovering that connection was Judge Felice Casson. During the 1980s, Casson reopened an investigation into a 1972 bombing in the Italian town of Pitano. Earlier inquiries had blamed left-wing extremists, but Casson's investigation uncovered evidence pointing toward a far-right militant instead. More importantly, he discovered indications that parts of the original investigation had been deliberately misdirected. As he followed the trail through classified records and intelligence documents, he encountered references to secret stay-behind structures that had never been publicly acknowledged. These discoveries helped bring Operation Gladio into public view. Another major event that intensified public scrutiny was the Bologna railway station bombing on August 2, 1980. A powerful explosion tore through one of Italy's busiest train stations. 85 people were killed and more than 200 were injured. It remains one of the deadliest terrorist attacks in modern Italian history. Italian courts later convicted members of a far-right extremist organization for carrying out the bombing. Yet debates continued over whether broader networks of support existed behind the attack. As investigations expanded, many journalists, researchers, and politicians began examining whether secret anti-communist structures had influenced events during the years of lead. Some argued that individuals connected to stay-behind organizations may have interacted with extremist networks. Others claimed Gladio itself had been directly involved in acts of terrorism. However, no definitive evidence has proven that Operation Gladio as an organization directed terrorist attacks. This distinction remains crucial. The existence of Gladio is a documented fact. The existence of terrorist violence during the years of lead is also a documented fact. The precise relationship between the two remains one of the most contested questions in Cold War history. Supporters of Gladio continued to argue that the network's purpose was defensive and that allegations linking it to terrorism were exaggerated or unsupported. Critics countered that decades of secrecy made it impossible to fully understand what occurred behind closed doors. By the end of the 1980s, the Cold War itself was beginning to collapse. The Berlin Wall was falling. Communist governments across Eastern Europe were losing power, and the Soviet Union was weakening. Just as the threat that had justified Gladio was disappearing, investigators were uncovering evidence of its existence. Soon a revelation from the Italian government would expose one of the Cold War's best-kept secrets and trigger a political shockwave across Europe. For decades, Operation Gladio remained hidden from public view. Its members stayed silent. Its records remained classified. And most Europeans had no idea that such networks existed. That changed in 1990. Following years of investigations into political violence and terrorism cases, Italian authorities found themselves confronting evidence that pointed toward a secret stay-behind structure. On October 24, 1990, Italian Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti officially informed Parliament of the existence of Operation Gladio. The announcement shocked the country. What many had dismissed as rumor or speculation was suddenly confirmed by the government itself. Italy had maintained a secret resistance network throughout the Cold War. But the surprise did not end there. Andreotti's statements revealed that Italy's network was part of a broader system that extended beyond national borders. As journalists and investigators began examining the story, they discovered similar organizations had existed across much of Western Europe. Governments in Belgium, Switzerland, the Netherlands, Germany, and other countries launched inquiries into their own stay-behind programs. Parliaments demanded answers. Newspapers devoted front pages to the story. For the first time, ordinary citizens learned that hidden military structures had operated for decades within democratic societies. The reaction was divided. Some viewed the revelation as evidence that Western governments had responsibly prepared for a genuine Soviet threat. From this perspective, Gladio represented an insurance policy against occupation. A secret defense plan that fortunately never had to be used. Others were deeply concerned. They questioned how organizations of such scale could exist without meaningful public oversight. Critics argued that even if the original purpose had been legitimate, democratic governments should never allow secret networks to operate beyond public scrutiny. The controversy soon spread beyond Italy. In November 1990, the European Parliament passed a resolution expressing concern about clandestine military and intelligence networks operating within member states. Investigations continued across Europe and debates intensified over what role these organizations had played during the Cold War. NATO and the United States consistently maintained that stay-behind networks were defensive preparations designed to resist a possible Soviet occupation. Officials rejected accusations that the alliance had directed terrorism or political violence. Yet, because much of the history remained classified, and because some records had disappeared, the debate never fully ended. The discovery of Gladio transformed what had once been a secret contingency plan into one of the most controversial intelligence stories of the 20th century. And more than 3 decades later, historians are still trying to separate documented fact from speculation and political myth. Operation Gladio remains one of the Cold War's most fascinating and controversial secrets. Today there is little debate about its existence. Government admissions, parliamentary investigations, and official records confirmed that secret stay-behind networks operated across much of Western Europe for decades. What remains debated is what those networks did beyond their original mission. The evidence clearly shows that they were created to resist a possible Soviet invasion. It also shows that they operated in extraordinary secrecy with limited public oversight. Beyond that, the historical picture becomes more complicated. Some allegations have been supported by investigations and court findings. Others remain disputed and continue to divide historians, researchers, and former officials. Perhaps that is why the story continues to attract attention. Operation Gladio sits at the intersection of fear, secrecy, intelligence, and democracy. It reminds us that governments often prepare for threats the public never sees. And sometimes those preparations remain hidden long after the danger has passed. The Cold War may have ended, but the questions raised by Operation Gladio still linger in the shadows of European history.